The letter arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, slid quietly beneath the heavy oak door of the study at Crestwood Hall. Nathaniel Cross picked it up from the floor, his pale fingers contrasting sharply with the cheap, rough paper. He did not receive many letters here in the mountains of Vermont, far from the crowded cities where his kind usually gathered. He was 31 years old, at least in the eyes of the few neighbors who saw him, though his white hair and strikingly pale skin made people look twice. He was the ruler of a quiet, old lineage, a king without a public crown, living a life of wealthy isolation. In 6 weeks, he was supposed to marry a woman he had only met 3 times during the formal social season. The engagement had been arranged by their families to join 2 large mountain estates, a practical agreement made over quiet dinners where everyone spoke politely about nothing at all. He walked to the tall glass window, holding the paper up to the gray morning light. The handwriting was messy and rushed, the ink smudged, as if the writer had been trembling or looking over their shoulder while holding the pen. The message was short and direct, telling him that before he took Miriam Cole as his wife, he needed to look closer at what she did when the lights went down. It claimed she was not the quiet, proper lady she appeared to be when sitting at dinner tables, and that her cold smiles hid secrets she kept from the world. There was no signature at the bottom of the page, no seal to show who had sent it, only the raw scent of cheap ink and fear. Nathaniel set the paper down on his desk, his red eyes narrowing slightly as he looked out at the frost covering his fields. Miriam was 29, dark-haired, and possessed a quiet manner that the local families called perfectly proper. During their few supervised walks through the town square, she had spoken with a calm voice, her gray eyes never showing any real emotion. His own associates had praised her restraint, saying she was exactly the kind of woman who could manage a large estate without causing any public drama or gossip. Yet, Nathaniel had heard the whispers in the local taverns and sitting rooms. People said she had no close friends, that she walked away from social gatherings without giving anyone a reason, and that her uncle, Arthur Cole, managed all her money with a very tight fist. She had turned down 3 other offers of marriage from wealthy landowners over the past 5 years, never explaining why to anyone in the valley. Nathaniel knew he could ignore the letter, as most men of his wealth would do, but his sharp senses made him restless. His ability to hear a heartbeat from across a room or catch the scent of dishonesty usually kept him safe. But Miriam had been an absolute mystery to him during their brief meetings. He decided he would not wait 6 weeks to find out who she really was behind her expensive dresses and polite nods. He called his head stable hand into the study, a trusted man who knew how to keep a secret, and asked him to find a place for a new laborer at the Cole estate. Within 3 days, a message was sent to Cole Meadow, requesting a job for a quiet groundskeeper named Thomas Finch, who had just arrived from the northern woods. He arrived at Cole Meadow on a foggy November morning, wearing a heavy wool coat that covered his broad shoulders and a battered leather hat pulled low over his white hair. He had left his carriage 2 miles down the mountain road, walking the rest of the way through the thick mud to ensure no one would suspect his true identity. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine and wood smoke as he walked into the main courtyard. The head gardener, a large man named Gideon with a face reddened by the cold wind, looked him over with a look of deep suspicion. Gideon wiped his hands on his canvas apron and asked if he really knew how to clear thick brush and handle heavy stone tools in the freezing weather. Nathaniel kept his voice low and flat, adopting the slow drawl of the mountain laborers he had observed for decades. He told Gideon he had spent 4 years clearing timber along the northern border and knew how to work without complaining about the frost. The older man grunted, seemingly satisfied by the short answer, and handed him a pair of heavy iron shears and a rusted spade. He pointed toward the long stone wall on the eastern edge of the property, telling him to cut back the dead thickets before the heavy snow started falling. Nathaniel took the tools, his unusually pale skin hidden beneath rough leather work gloves, and walked out into the damp garden to begin his first afternoon of hard manual labor. He spent hours cutting back the tangled briars, his supernatural strength hidden behind slow, deliberate movements, so the other workers would not notice anything strange. The servants passed by him without a second glance, treating him like any other poor traveler looking for a few coins and a hot meal. When darkness fell, he ate his supper in the loud kitchen, sitting at the far end of the long wooden table, with two young stable boys and a housemaid. An elderly woman named Ellen, who worked as Miriam's personal maid, sat at the head of the table, eating her soup in total silence. Nathaniel listened to the idle gossip of the house, but no one spoke of Miriam, and she did not appear in the lower rooms at all that evening. The next morning, Nathaniel rose before the sun had even cleared the mountain ridges, his eyes perfectly adapted to the deep shadows of the estate. The house was completely still, the morning air so cold that his breath should have formed white clouds, though his vampire nature kept his body cool and silent. As he began clearing a section of the cracked stone walkway near the side door, he heard the faint click of a brass latch opening. He stepped back into the dark shadow of a large cedar tree, pulling his hat down. Miriam stepped out into the courtyard, moving with quick, purposeful steps that looked nothing like her slow, measured walks in the town square. She was not wearing her usual silk dress, or the fine leather shoes he had seen her wear during their formal dinners. Instead, she wore a simple gray wool cloak that looked old and worn, and her dark hair was tied back with a piece of plain twine. She held a small leather bag tightly against her side, her knuckles white from the grip, as if the contents were more valuable than anything else she owned. Ellen followed close behind her, leaning heavily on a wooden walking stick, as they hurried toward the small wooden gate at the edge of the woods. Nathaniel waited until they had cleared the clearing, then set his spade down on the frozen ground and followed them into the dark forest. Nathaniel moved through the dense trees with absolute silence, his boots barely making a sound on the frozen leaves as he tracked the two women. His sharp eyes allowed him to keep a safe distance, watching the gray cloak flash between the dark pine trunks in the early morning light. They walked for nearly 3 miles along an old logging path that most townspeople avoided due to the steep rocks and thick mud. The path eventually opened up into a small broken valley, where a few rough timber cabins stood against the mountain slope. This was Silver Creek, a place where the poorest woodcutters lived, far away from the wealthy shops and clean streets of the main town. A small horse-drawn wagon was waiting near a broken stone well at the entrance of the settlement. The driver, an old man who nodded to Ellen without speaking. Miriam did not climb into the wagon immediately. Instead, she walked directly to the door of the first cabin, where the roof had partially collapsed under the weight of an early autumn storm. A thin man with tired eyes opened the door, his clothes covered in sawdust and his face worn from hunger. Miriam opened her leather bag and pulled out a small stack of folded paper money, pressing it directly into the man's rough hands before he could even say a word of greeting. The woodcutter looked down at the money, his shoulders dropping as a deep look of relief washed over his face, replacing the hard lines of worry that had been there a moment before. He tried to thank her, his voice shaking in the cold air, but Miriam simply touched his arm gently and spoke a few low words that Nathaniel could not catch from the edge of the woods. She moved quickly to the next cabin, leaving supplies and small leather pouches at each door, with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Nathaniel stood hidden behind a massive pine tree, watching her work in the mud while the cold wind whipped her hair across her face. He realized she was using her own personal funds to keep these families from freezing or starving, spending her mornings in the dirt while the rest of the town believed she was sleeping in a warm bed. Everything he had assumed about her based on the gossip in the city began to fall apart in his mind. He had come here expecting to find some dark secret or political plot, but instead, he was watching his future wife act as a protector to people the rest of the world had completely forgotten. He slipped back into the trees before she completed her rounds, running ahead to ensure he was back at his station before the wagon returned. He was back at the stone wall by the time Gideon came out to check on the morning's progress. his iron shears cutting through the thickets with regular rhythmic snaps. Miriam returned an hour later, entering through the main gates in her fine carriage this time, dressed in a beautiful blue coat with her hair perfectly pinned. She did not look toward the gardens as she walked into the main house, her face returning to that same cold, distant expression she wore for the public. Nathaniel watched her from the edge of the lawn, wondering how a person could live two entirely different lives, so close together, without breaking under the weight of the secret. That evening, the quiet atmosphere of Cole Meadow disappeared, as three expensive carriages arrived from the neighboring valleys, bringing wealthy landowners for a formal dinner party. The front windows of the house blazed with the light of dozens of wax candles, and the scent of roasting meat drifted down into the servants' quarters. Nathaniel stood in the shadows of the long hallway near the kitchen, helping a footman carry extra logs for the great fireplaces in the dining room. He watched as the guests walked up the wide stairs, their loud voices and expensive clothes filling the house with an artificial energy that felt completely out of place after the morning's quiet trip. Miriam came down the stairs wearing a white silk dress that rustled against the floor, her dark hair held in place by fine silver combs that caught the candlelight. She greeted each guest with a small, polite nod, her voice smooth and completely devoid of the warmth he had heard her use with the woodcutter. She sat at the center of the long table, listening to an older man complain about the cost of shipping timber while she ate small portions of food without any real interest. Nathaniel stood near the doorway with the other servants, completely invisible to the wealthy guests, his dark eyes fixed on her face as he tried to reconcile the two women. He stayed in the shadow of the heavy curtains for 2 hours, watching her laugh at the correct moments and ask polite questions that made the guests feel important. To anyone else, she looked like a cold, ambitious woman who cared only about status and proper manners, exactly as the rumors in town had claimed. But Nathaniel could see the small tension in her jaw and the way her fingers pressed tightly against her napkin whenever her Uncle Arthur spoke about her upcoming marriage. He began to understand that the coldness everyone complained about was not her true nature, but a shield she used to keep the world from looking too closely at her life. 4 days passed before Miriam left the estate again, and this time Nathaniel was fully prepared for the journey. He had spent the days watching the movements of the household, learning exactly when the servants took their breaks and when Arthur Cole retired to his private library to check the logging accounts. He noticed that the house staff never questioned Miriam's absences, simply accepting her explanation that she was visiting a cousin or looking at dress fabrics in the town. He slipped out of the side gate before the sun rose, his white hair hidden under his dark wool hat, as he followed her carriage down the mountain toward the coast. The road led them down to a small lakeside port called Cold Spring, a rough town where fishermen and dock workers lived in low timber houses along the gray water. The air here was heavy with the smell of wet wood, fish scales, and the cold dampness that rose from the lake every morning. Miriam left her carriage at a small livery stable on the edge of town, continuing on foot through the narrow, muddy alleys where the wealthy visitors never went. She wore her plain gray cloak again, carrying a large woven basket over her arm, while Ellen walked beside her, both of them moving with familiar ease through the damp streets. Nathaniel walked along the parallel alleyways, his quiet movements allowing him to watch her through the gaps between the old buildings without being seen. He noticed that the people in this town did not bow or step aside when she passed, as they would for a wealthy landowner's niece. Instead, a man mending a fishing net outside his door simply waved his hand and called out a casual greeting, addressing her only as Miss Mary. Miriam stopped to speak with an old woman sitting on a wooden bench, listening to her talk about the low price of fish before pressing a small parcel into her hands. He watched her enter 3 more small houses, including a low cabin where a young widow lived with 2 small children whose father had been lost on the lake the previous winter. At each stop, she left food from her basket or a small envelope that Nathaniel suspected contained enough money to cover their winter wood supply. She did not stay long enough to receive grand thanks, simply completing her tasks with a quiet determination that showed this was part of a long-term routine. Nathaniel leaned against an old wooden piling near the water, watching her gray cloak disappear around a corner, feeling a strange warmth in his chest. He realized his initial suspicions had been completely foolish, born from his own long years of isolation and mistrust of the humans who lived around his mountain home. The question was no longer what dark secret she was hiding from him, but why she felt the need to hide such immense kindness from the society she lived in. He knew that if the wealthy families in the valley found out she was spending her time and money in these broken towns, they would view it as a scandal. They would see her actions as a sign of weakness or eccentric behavior that did not fit the image of a proper lady of the estate. The answer to his questions came from the person he least expected to speak with him during a quiet afternoon back at Coal Meadow. Ellen, the old maid, was a sharp-eyed woman who rarely spoke to the outdoor workers, spending most of her days in the upper rooms or by the small fire in the servants' kitchen. But she had a fondness for strong black tea and a quiet room, and Nathaniel had taken care to fix the broken wooden latch on her window without being asked. On a wet Thursday afternoon, when a cold rain kept everyone indoors, she set an extra porcelain cup on the wooden table and pointed to the chair across from her. Nathaniel sat down slowly, keeping his hands flat on the table, his long fingers completely still as he waited for her to speak first. Ellen looked at his hands for a long moment, her eyes moving from his unblemished skin to his heavy boots, before she picked up her tea. She told him he was not from the northern woods, because groundskeepers from that area did not have hands that looked like they had never held an axe before this winter. She said she did not care what his real name was, because he had been respectful to the kitchen staff and had not caused any trouble since he arrived. They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the rain beat against the small glass panes and the distant sound of the wood fire crackling in the main hall. Nathaniel took a slow sip of his tea, keeping his voice carefully neutral, as he mentioned that Lady Miriam seemed to go out a great deal for someone who was preparing for a grand wedding. Ellen's needle paused over the wool stocking she was mending, her face softening slightly as she looked into the small flames of the hearth. She said that Miriam had been doing this since she was 14 years old, starting right after her mother had passed away. Ellen smoothed the gray wool in her lap, her voice dropping into a quiet tone that forced Nathaniel to lean forward to hear her clearly over the sound of the rain. She spoke of a woman named Sarah Jenkins, a kind teacher who had come to live at the estate when Miriam was only 8 years old. Sarah had raised the girl after her mother died, teaching her how to read several languages, how to play the piano, and how to speak to a servant with the same respect she would give to a wealthy governor. Sarah had grown up in the poor mountain villages and knew how hard the winters could be for families who had no land of their own. When the timber mills began to close 12 years ago, Sarah would spend her evenings reading letters from her old neighbors, sitting very still by the fire with a look of deep sorrow on her face. She fell ill with a winter cough when Miriam turned 19, the sickness moving through her lungs so quickly that the local doctor could do nothing to stop it. Miriam had refused to leave her side, sitting by the bed for 3 weeks, until the final night when Sarah called her close. She asked the young girl to promise that she would look after those 7 hidden settlements in the mountains, ensuring they survived the bitter winters. Miriam had given her word to the dying woman, and she had kept that promise every single day for 10 long years, even when her uncle Arthur began to restrict her money. When the seasonal allowance was not enough to cover the cost of grain and wood for the villages, Miriam would quietly sell her own pieces of jewelry to common traders in the distant towns. She traveled in hired wagons like a common merchant's wife, learning the name of every child and every debt in the valley so she could help them without her uncle ever finding out. Ellen picked up her needle again, telling him that was the only reason her lady went out into the cold. Nathaniel sat perfectly still after the old woman finished speaking, his sharp mind processing the truth of the situation with a cold sense of shame. He thought about the expensive silver combs in Miriam's hair, and the perfect, distant smile she wore at the dinner table, while the entire town viewed her as a cold creature. Not one of the wealthy suitors who had tried to marry her had ever bothered to look past her quiet manners to see the strength hidden beneath her silk dresses. He had nearly made the same mistake, letting an anonymous letter and his own cold nature guide his judgment of a woman who was braver than anyone he had ever met. The weather turned bitter in early December, bringing the kind of deep frost that settled into the stone foundations of the house and turned the mountain roads into solid sheets of ice. The sky hung low and dark over the valley for days, promising a heavy snowstorm that would shut down all travel between the towns before the week was over. Nathaniel returned from his work in the garden each evening, with his mind fixed on the letter Miriam had been writing to his estate, a letter Ellen had mentioned during their quiet talks by the fire. Miriam was planning to end the engagement before the official announcement was made. She believed that becoming the wife of a wealthy landowner with a large estate would make it impossible for her to keep her promise to Sarah Jenkins. She thought her new responsibilities in the city would prevent her from disappearing into the mountains in her plain gray cloak, and she refused to make a marriage vow she could not keep. Nathaniel knew he could not simply tell her the truth about his identity without explaining why he had spent weeks pretending to be a common laborer in her garden. He felt caught in a trap of his own making, his time running out as the snow began to fall over the mountain ridges. The storm hit the valley on a Friday morning, bringing fierce winds that drove the dry snow sideways across the courtyard and piled it high against the wooden barn doors. Gideon called all the men into the tool shed before noon, declaring that no work could be done in such a blinding freeze, and telling everyone to stay near the kitchen fires. Nathaniel was helping a young stable hand secure the heavy leather blankets on the carriage horses when Ellen hurried into the barn, her woolen shawl soaked with snow and her old face pale with panic. Word had just arrived from the highest settlement on the mountain. A young child in the village of Pine Ridge was burning with a terrible fever, and the deep snow drifts had already blocked the only road that led down to the valley where the doctor lived. The family had no medicine left, and the wind was growing stronger with every passing hour, making it dangerous for any ordinary traveler to attempt the steep climb. Nathaniel looked up at the frosted windows of the main house, knowing exactly what Miriam would do before she even gave the order. He began harnessing the strongest workhorse to a heavy timber sleigh before she even reached the courtyard. Miriam appeared in the barn doorway less than 10 minutes later, her heavy gray cloak pulled tight around her face, and a leather medical bag strapped across her shoulder. She stopped when she saw Nathaniel adjusting the iron buckles on the horse's harness, her gray eyes narrowing in surprise as she looked at the heavy sleigh. She told him she had not asked for a driver and that the mountain roads were far too dangerous for anyone who did not know the terrain. Nathaniel did not look up from his work, his hands moving with steady efficiency as he secured the final leather strap against the horse's flank. He told her that the regular drivers were terrified of the storm, and that Gideon had sent him because he had experience handling heavy loads in the northern snow. It was a lie, but Miriam did not have the time to argue, as the wind howled through the open barn doors, spraying dry ice across the wooden floor. She climbed onto the wooden bench of the sleigh, tucking her bag between her boots, while Nathaniel took the heavy leather reins in his gloved hands. They moved out of the courtyard into the blinding white storm, the horse straining against the deep snow as they headed up the mountain trail. The climb was brutal from the very first mile, the wind hitting them with full force as they left the shelter of the lower valley trees and moved onto the open ridges. The snow was falling so thickly that Nathaniel could barely see past the horse's ears, relying on his sharp vampire sight to pick out the dark edges of the trail beneath the drifts. Miriam sat beside him on the open bench, her face white from the cold air, but her eyes remained fixed on the white darkness ahead. She called out directions when the path split, her memory of the mountain so perfect that she knew every dangerous curve and hidden ditch. An hour into the ascent, the left runner of the sleigh caught the hidden edge of a large granite boulder buried deep beneath a fresh drift of snow. The heavy wooden vehicle lurched violently to the side, the horse screaming as it lost its footing on the slick ice beneath the white powder. The sleigh tipped at a sharp angle, and Miriam was thrown from the bench before she could grab the wooden handrail to steady herself. Nathaniel dropped the reins and reached out with supernatural speed, catching her by the waist before she could hit the sharp rocks at the edge of the ravine. He held her firmly against his chest for a second, his boots anchoring them both to the tilting frame of the sleigh with a strength that no common laborer could ever possess. The horse found its footing again, pulling the runner free from the boulder with a loud scrape, and the vehicle righted itself with a heavy thud. They were both breathing heavily in the freezing silence that followed, the wind blowing a curtain of white snow around them like a wall. Miriam looked down at his arm, which was still wrapped around her waist, her eyes wide as she realized how easily he had held her weight against the wind. She stepped back onto the wooden floorboards, her breath forming small white clouds, as she looked up into his face with a look of deep realization. She told him that no regular groundskeeper from the northern woods had reflexes like that, nor did they look at a freezing storm without blinking their eyes. She asked him to take off his hat and tell her his true name, because she refused to ride any further up the mountain with a man who was hiding behind a false face. Nathaniel reached up slowly, pulling the wet leather hat from his head, allowing his white hair to blow free in the cold wind. He looked at her with his dark red eyes, his pale skin completely uncovered in the gray light of the mountain storm, and told her his name was Nathaniel Cross. Miriam did not scream or try to run from the sleigh, though she clearly knew what he was from the old stories the townspeople told about the lords of Crestwood Hall. She simply sat down on the wooden bench, her hands trembling slightly within her wool gloves, as she asked him why the Vampire King had spent 3 weeks clearing briars in her garden. Nathaniel took the reins again, his voice quiet and steady, as he told her about the anonymous letter. He explained everything as they moved slowly through the falling snow, telling her how he had followed her to Silver Creek and watched her pay the woodcutter's debt in the early morning mud. He told her about his trips to the lakeside port and his long talk with old Ellen by the kitchen fire, where he had learned about Sarah Jenkins and the promise that guided her life. He told her he knew about the letter she had written to end their engagement, and that he understood why she was willing to give up her own future to protect the people who lived in these forgotten cabins. Miriam listened to his story without interrupting a single time, her gray eyes fixed on his pale face, while the sleigh moved through the deep drifts toward the high ridge. When he finished speaking, the wind seemed to lose some of its fury, pulling back to leave a quiet stillness over the white forest around them. She turned her head toward the dark valley below, her voice very soft, as she said that he had come to her estate to judge her like a criminal. Nathaniel admitted that he had made a terrible mistake, letting his own old doubts guide his choices instead of his own eyes. He told her that he had stayed at Coal Meadow long after his questions were answered, because he could not bear the thought of leaving her to face her burdens alone. He said he had watched her crouch in the dirt to comfort a crying child, and realized she possessed a courage that he had never seen in all his long years of life. He leaned forward, looking at her directly, as he promised that if she married him, she would never have to sell her mother's jewelry again to buy grain for the settlements. He told her that his own vast wealth and the power of his estate would be hers to use for these families. They reached the small settlement of Pine Ridge by mid-afternoon, finding the woodcutter's cabin surrounded by 3 feet of fresh snow that had drifted against the low timber door. Miriam hurried inside with her medicine bag, while Nathaniel stayed in the lean-to at the back, using his strength to chop a large pile of dry firewood for the family. The young child's fever began to break before the sun went down, the mother weeping with relief as she thanked Miriam for coming through the dangerous storm. They stayed in the cabin until the morning light broke over the peaks, the road down now clear and quiet. The journey back down the mountain was silent, but it was a comfortable silence that felt entirely different from the cold distance they had shared during their formal dinners in the city. Nathaniel drove the horse with steady hands, while Miriam sat close beside him on the wooden bench, her gray cloak brushing against his heavy wool coat. When they returned to the gates of Cole Meadow, she took her medicine bag and walked toward the house without saying a word about the future, but she looked back at him once from the stone steps, her face softer than it had ever been before. 3 days later, a messenger arrived at Crestwood Hall, with word that Arthur Cole had called a public meeting of the local landowners at the town hall in Burlington. The stated purpose of the gathering was to discuss the management of the timber roads, but Nathaniel's sources informed him that Arthur intended to raise the matter of his niece's missing funds. Arthur had discovered that Miriam's personal bank accounts were nearly empty, and planned to use the information to declare her unfit to manage her own inheritance. Nathaniel dressed in his finest black coat, his white hair combed back, and ordered his grandest carriage. He walked into the large meeting room in Burlington just as Arthur was rising to speak to the assembled wealth of the valley, the heavy oak doors slamming open with a loud thud that made everyone turn. The room went completely silent as the Vampire King stepped inside, his pale presence drawing every eye as he walked down the center aisle with slow, deliberate steps. Arthur stopped mid-sentence, his heavy jaw dropping slightly before he tried to regain his composure and welcome his wealthy neighbor to the table. Nathaniel did not smile. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He placed the papers on the long wooden table in front of the town officials, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the large room without him ever needing to raise it. The documents contained a complete record of every dollar Arthur had taken from Miriam's timber accounts over the past 5 years, contrasted with the records of her own quiet spending in the mountain villages. Nathaniel explained that Miriam had not wasted her money on foolish things, but had been doing the work of a true protector while her uncle was busy filling his own pockets with stolen wealth. Arthur tried to speak, his face turning a deep crimson as he looked around the room at his neighbors, but he found no support among the men who had just seen the proof of his dishonesty. He had no answer for the precise figures laid out on the table, nor could he face the cold authority of the white-haired man standing across from him. Miriam stood near the back doorway, her gray cloak damp from the winter air, watching Nathaniel with an expression that he could not quite read from the front of the hall. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, as Arthur quietly left the room. The legal dispute over the estate was settled within a week, with the town council transferring full control of the Cole inheritance to Miriam, completely free of her uncle's interference. Arthur left the valley before the new year, moving to a distant city where his reputation could not follow him, leaving Cole Meadow entirely in his niece's quiet hands. Nathaniel returned to his own estate at Crestwood Hall, spending his winter days managing his properties and waiting for some word from the woman he had spent weeks watching from the garden wall. He wrote her one short letter, offering his congratulations on her freedom. He did not receive a reply until the early weeks of spring, when the deep mountain snow began to melt into rushing streams and the first green grass appeared along the valley floors. A small envelope was left at his gate on a sunny April afternoon, written on fine paper this time, bearing her own small wax seal at the back. The note was short, asking him to meet her at the small wooden gate at the edge of the Cole Meadow forest, where he had first followed her gray cloak. Nathaniel walked down the mountain path that evening, his white hair uncovered in the warm twilight air. Miriam was waiting for him by the old wooden fence, wearing a simple green dress that matched the new leaves on the trees around them, her dark hair tied back without any silver combs. She looked up at him as he approached, a small smile appearing on her face for the first time since they had met during the formal winter season. She told him that she had spent 3 months being angry with him for deceiving her in her own garden, and another month being angry with herself for letting him help her at the town meeting. Nathaniel stopped a few feet away from her, keeping his hands in his pockets as he looked out at the peaceful valley below them, the lights of the distant cabins beginning to twinkle in the dusk. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small gold ring, plain, and without any large gems that would draw the eyes of the townspeople. He told her it was not a grand king asking for a proper queen to sit in a cold castle, but a man who had seen her strength in a mountain storm and wanted to stand beside her for the next 40 winters. Miriam looked at the plain gold ring in his pale palm for a long moment, then reached out and took it with steady fingers, her gray eyes clear and bright in the twilight. She told him that the 7 villages would always come first in her heart, and that she would not change her morning rounds for any rules of high society. Nathaniel smiled, his pale face catching the last red rays of the sun as it sank behind the mountain peaks, and told her he would expect nothing less from the woman he loved. They married on a quiet morning in June, choosing a small timber church near the mountain path rather than the grand cathedral in the city that their families had originally planned for the wedding. The guest list was small, consisting only of old Ellen, Gideon the head gardener, and 20 families from the mountain settlements who sat together in the wooden pews. The woodcutter from Silver Creek stood near the back door, wearing a clean shirt that Miriam had provided, his face bright with a genuine smile as the couple walked down the aisle together into the warm summer light. Nathaniel stood on the wide stone terrace of Crestwood Hall, watching the summer sun sink slowly behind the green ridges of the Vermont mountains, casting long purple shadows across the valley floor. Beside him, Miriam leaned against the wooden railing, her dark hair blowing gently in the warm evening breeze, while the small gold ring on her finger caught the last light of day. In the valley below, the distant lights of the small cabins were beginning to appear, one by one, like small stars fallen against the dark forest floor, showing that the families were warm and safe in their homes. He knew that the coming years would bring more long winters and heavy storms to these mountains, but the old fear that had guided his long life of isolation had completely disappeared from his heart. He understood now that a true marriage was not built on the polite agreements of wealthy families or the perfect manners displayed at crowded dinner tables, but on the quiet choices made in the dark, when no one else was watching. He had spent decades hiding his true nature from the world, believing that his pale skin and white hair marked him as a creature who could never share a real connection with the humans who lived below his high gates. Yet, a single anonymous letter and a pair of rusty garden shears had led him to a woman who possessed a strength that matched his own, a woman who had taught him that the truest power lay in protecting those who could offer nothing in return. The future stretched out before them like the long mountain paths they had traveled together in the blinding snow, full of steep climbs and unpredictable turns, but they would face each challenge with a shared purpose that no town gossip could ever shake. Miriam turned her head to look up at him, her gray eyes soft with a deep, quiet contentment that required no words to explain, her hand sliding naturally into his pale palm as the night air began to cool. He looked out over his vast lands, knowing that Sarah Jenkins' promise would be kept for generations to come, and that the quiet king and his brave queen had finally found a place where they belonged, high above the whispers of the world.